Lecture 7, Gender and Political Action. So today we're looking at the role of women in particular in political movements in the late 18th, early 19th century, and the idea more generally of gender history and how it's changed our approach to this subject. So we'll briefly think about separate spheres as a model, then we'll look at female involvement in 18th century politics, women in food riots, and the role of women in the early 19th century parliamentary reform movements. So separate spheres is a really influential model, a theoretical model, which historians have debated a lot about in terms of how people at the time conceptualized gender, how different were men and women. And there's this idea that men and women operated in separate spheres. So a man operated in a public sphere that was to do with work, with money, with power, and therefore it's only men who could take part in the political nation, whereas women had different characteristics, which meant that they were domestic, that they had a home role, and they couldn't take part in politics. And this idea is propagated in contemporary literature. If you see all the conduct manuals of the time, how men and women are supposed to behave, there's a perceived idea that men and women are very different and have different characteristics and therefore different roles in society. And this model has been called separate spheres by historians, and you see it in a lot of the gender history of this time. The book in front of you is by Robert Shoemaker, who questions, is this the period when this idea of separate spheres emerges? But if you read a really influential article by Amanda Vickery about the emergence of separate spheres, she argues to the contrary, that this isn't the era when separate spheres emerge, that actually this idea has been in British history for a very long time, much longer than before 1650, but also that men and women did not fit these categories. There are lots of examples in which it was just an ideal, a middle-class model to aspire to, but particularly working-class women and also aristocratic women stepped over into the other sphere, if you like, that they broke through gender roles in the actions that they did, the attitudes that they had. So it's still a very hotly debated topic of whether this existed or not, but you'll see many parallels in contemporary ideas about the differences between men and women, boys and girls. For example, the Pink Stinks campaign, which is trying to fight against this idea that girls' toys have to be about princesses and are pink, and boys' toys are all about construction and are blue. Those sorts of debates about what gender roles that men and women and boys and girls should have. There's a recent TV series about it too. So it's still a very hot topic about the differences between men and women, male and female. So what roles did women play in popular protest in this era? And we'll be looking at food rights to start off with. And there's quite a lot of historical debate about what role did women play in the food riots. And we've already seen how women seem to play a dominant role in the descriptions of food riots, in the depictions, such as the cartoon, of women really being at the forefront of negotiating over market prices, over accusing merchants of forestalling the grain and putting up the prices artificially. And there is a debate about to what extent are women being particularly picked on by the reports, which are obviously mostly written by men and as seen as overly violent in food riots. To what extent were women playing a part in food riots that made them what contemporaries called a revolt of the housewives? And we'll debate that in the session. But there's recent new research about, in particular, aristocratic women also playing a large part in politics of the time. Remember that politics in the 18th century, even though it's very exclusionary and very paternal and patriarchal, is still very open in the sorts of opportunities that people could have to influence voters and the voting process. So the whole rigmarole of a parliamentary election where there's lots of feasts and balls and dinners and open hustings allow women to take part. And there are some very famous women who try to put forward their political views. The most famous is Georgiana, Duchess of Devonshire, who gets very involved in the 1784 general election in support of her favourite candidate, Charles James Fox, of the Whig Party. And here the cartoon portrays her in the colours of the Whig Party, and that she's dressing up in the colours to support them, and also you can see the foxtails and the miniature fox. Again, it's caricature, it's making fun of her, but there's clear evidence that a lot of aristocratic women are organising the balls, being behind the scenes in trying to influence the voting. But Georgiana gets a lot of criticism for her role. So again, is she stepping over the separate spheres divide in trying to act as a political woman? And so there's a huge amount of, if you like, tabloid criticism of her part and her friend's part in trying to influence the vote. So in Thomas Rowlandson's prints, The Two Patriotic Duchesses, she's been criticised not only for trying to cavort with voters to try and get them to vote in this case in the very large constituency of Westminster, but also stepping over the class boundary. Here she's trying to kiss a butcher to persuade him to vote. There's a whole lot of sexual innuendo here, again, as an attack on her. But it shows you there's high-profile women who are trying to get involved in politics in this era. And there's more general ways in which middle and upper class women got involved. So not just in elections, but also in more general political events, such as the Restoration, when George III came back to the throne after his illness. And so you've got, again, caricatures of women with ribbons in their hair and on their clothes, saying, "God save the King." So there's various ways in which women were involved in the political public sphere, if you like. They're not hiding at home in a domestic sphere. But there's a big change. As with throughout this module, I've stated that the French Revolution is a big turning point in persuading working class men and now women to campaign for parliamentary reform. So as we've seen in the accounts of Peterloo, women play a very big part in the mass platform reform movement. They form their own societies in 1819 to campaign for the vote for their menfolk. And again, they're hugely criticised in the popular press for this. And criticised amongst the male reformers themselves. You know, why are these women stepping out of the home and onto the public platform? So we'll look at this caricature in more detail. It's quite a complex one, but again, there's huge lots of sexual innuendo in here, accusing the women of being like men. So they're dressed up in trousers and looking very ugly on the stage while they're giving their speeches. So there's huge criticism, not just from the anti-radical, but also among the radicals, for the women's part in trying to push forward the reform agenda. But it's hugely significant that women get involved in 1819. So first of all, a warning. Remember that women did not campaign for female suffrage in this period. They're campaigning for the vote for men. So don't impute any kind of feminist ideas about women's role in this time. Although there are some writers who people see as the founders of feminism, such as Mary Wollstonecraft, they weren't campaigning for the female vote either. It's still a very minority idea. The working class in particular, you know, have a big enough battle to face getting the men the vote before they even start thinking about women. So even feminist writers still see women's main role as educating their children to be future citizens. So if you read Samuel Bamford's passage in The Life of the Radical, if you've read about Peterloo, you'll see the changing ideas about women's role within the reform movement. So he describes these meetings where the women start to vote within the reform meetings, but again, the men are suspicious of this, or at least think it's a bit of a joke, so they laugh at the end when the women are voting. So it's an ambiguous attitude even among the reform movement to women's role. After Peterloo and the suppression of the 6 Acts, we get this very unusual incident, an event in the Reform campaign, which is known as the Queen Caroline Affair. And we'll be looking at this in more detail, but it's important because essentially it seems to be led by women and women's participation. So it's an outlet for discontent after Peterloo and the 6 Acts have clamped down on campaigning for parliamentary reform, but you can still campaign on so-called patriotic issues. So Queen Caroline is the former wife of the Prince Regent, who, when he becomes king, and George IV in 1820, she comes back from her exile in Italy to try and reclaim the throne, if you like. I mean, she wouldn't be the full queen, but she wants to be known as Queen Caroline. And there's a huge outpouring of support for Queen Caroline. George IV tries to divorce her formally, and so it gets dragged through, the court drags through the House of Lords where the divorce has to take place. So it's a tabloid dream. It's all over the papers, all the dirty laundry of their various affairs and dalliances are splashed across the headlines, the pages. And so this is a really sort of high-profile event where it's really interesting that the women who had previously been taking part in the reform demonstrations rally to Queen Caroline's side. They see her as a wronged wife, that she's got a rightful claim to the throne. Eventually ends up in a damp squib, even though there's huge demonstrations for her. Eventually, essentially, George IV pays her off and she dies quite soon afterwards. But it's this one great burst of popular activity that's semi-legal after the repression of Peterloo. And it shows you again how women are starting to form political movements in themselves. And there's a lot of memorabilia about Queen Caroline. If you just search through auction catalogues or the British Museum, you'll see lots of these sorts of plates and things in support of a woman who probably cares very little for the working class at all, but she becomes this figurehead for the movement. So by the time we get to Chartism, women's role is a bit more subdued. The Chartism, even though it is a very family-oriented movement, and it has women on the membership card that you can see there, is still very much led by men. You don't really get any prominent women leaders, whereas in the Peterloo era, in the mass platform era, you had women leaders of reform societies speaking on stages and having a fairly prominent role. Chartism is very patriarchal in the sense that it's led by men. All the committees and the National Convention are men, and women very occasionally get up in local meetings to speak, but the female Chartist societies are very much seen as auxiliary to the movement. They're not an essential part of it. So we've seen how the Chartist land plan is very family oriented. There are lots of events and campaigning that's meant to be inclusive for women and children, but there's very little call for women to play a big part in the movement. There's no call for female suffrage, essentially, and women are very much seen as in the sidelines, this movement. So comparing the mass platform movement, the 18 teens, with Chartism, you can see that women's role is very much more minor. And you can read about that in Anna Clark's book, The Struggle for the Breeches.